Welcome, everyone. We're so excited. It feels like we've been kind of counting down to launch date for a while. I hope you're as excited as we are. Tim and I have we built this beautiful intro slide, and I'm just going to put it up right here. So welcome. Here's who we are. And then as we're talking about this, we said, this doesn't actually sound like we're introducing ourselves as actual humans. You get to know, a typical Western management kind of way of introducing yourself, which is I am the education I've had or the jobs I've done or those kinds of things. And really this is, this slide is up here just so that we can say, we acknowledge this is what this typically looks like, but we'd really like to take a minute just to kind of introduce ourselves and who we are as human beings. Because that's actually, the relational aspect of this is what'll actually help us to build community in this group, but will also help us, advance the work we're trying to advance in our own organizations and in our lives and the work that we do in general. So Tim, I'd like to invite you to offer an introduction to the group.
I'm Tim Sinova, he, him. I currently reside in Stowe, Vermont, land of the Abenaki. I'm a white guy. I was a former trombonist, which is best that former for everyone involved, that I no longer play trombone, both for the world and just music in general. Since 2013, I have, with my former organization, been on a journey to understand how racism and oppression is baked into much of everything we do as organizations. And specifically as a white guy who holds power and relative privilege, really understanding what my role is in that. And I recently, about I think 2 weeks ago or so, just launched a new podcast series. It's a 12-part podcast series called White Men and the Journey Towards Anti-Racism, where I sat down, where I had an opportunity to interview 12 white guys who are in positions of leadership of organizations who are engaged in anti-racism, anti-oppression work, to record conversations primarily as a resource for other white guys who would benefit from hearing these conversations. And so that's been rolling out. It's really an interesting aspect of organizational design and how white guys are trying to show up and not show up and what in this work. So that's a little bit about me. People have also said I'm tall because we're all sort of the same height on Zoom. So I guess that's a fun fact, I guess. But yeah, that's me. Katrina, how about you?
This is basically what it was like recording the podcast. Yeah, so Katrina Donald, she, her. I was born in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is Treaty 1 territory. My family comes from Ukraine and from Scotland, and so we're watching the news these days and doing what we can to support the war in Ukraine. But right now, I'm living in Treaty 7 territory in a beautiful town in the Canadian Rockies called Banff, Alberta, and it's Treaty 7 territory, home of Métis Nation number 3. And out my window, I have these beautiful mountains that my son, who's 5 years old, Huck, he has renamed to be all the famous mountains he knows in the world. And so he brings his stories into our town, and we use a lot of imagination in that way. And so we're really learning about different parts of the world, and I'm really learning about as I kind of grow in my developmental evaluation career, as I go around in my own journey, which actually, my anti-racism, anti-oppression journey really began because of data. So working in organizations, I did a lot of participant experience and that kind of action research work. And what I started to learn about was that there were so many opportunities in organizations that we could be doing, a better job at having inclusive and equitable spaces, at really understanding, how organizations are just allowing those typical systems to kind of continue. And it kind of boiled up in me. And that's where kind of my official training began. And so there's been a long journey there for me, and one that involves actively practicing. And so over the last year, I have I began Ever So Curious, and I did that so that I could work with organizations who are really interested in learning and really interested in hearing multiple perspectives and having conversations that really encourage them to be curious and to be humble and to imagine what change could look like, and then to figure out, that developmental evaluation approach, which is, how do we start with small things and see what kind of impact and feedback we're getting to help us to encourage evidence-based decisions of where we take this work next in our organization. And so that's really what brought me into the work with Tim. I joined the shared leadership course, and through that work, we started to talk about all of the different things that we had in common. So I have an HR background, I'm a certified recruiter, I'm a developmental evaluator, but I'm also just deeply curious about this space and really committed to doing my own work and encouraging the work of others to build more anti-oppressive spaces. I'm so happy to be here with all of you.
One of the quotes that my colleagues at my former organization, Fracture Atlas, and I came across was from, again, the brilliance of Adrienne Marie Brown in their Emergent Strategies book. And this quote is actually, art is not neutral. But as we read it and we sort of reflected on it, we thought this is actually a really helpful frame when thinking about reimagining workplaces that center values of equity, justice, anti-racism, anti-oppression. And so I always like to come back to this as grounding for why I do this work and for why we can do this work together. Adrienne wrote, "The workplace is not neutral. It either upholds or disrupts the status quo, advancing or regressing justice. We are living now inside the imagination of people who thought economic disparity and environmental destruction were acceptable costs for their power. It is our right and responsibility to write ourselves into the future. All organizing is science fiction. If you're shaping the future, you are a futurist. And visionary fiction is a way to practice the future in our minds alone and together." And I really feel like this brings to life the why, and also the why the co-creation. We're all here to create something that doesn't exist yet. And I think that's the fun thing about being in a group with people who are all like, yeah, let's totally figure out how this works, and in a way that's bespoke to our organizations and the way we want to, in the values we hold, and the way we want to operate. And especially given this moment in which we're all living, going into year 3 of a global pandemic, rethinking how we work, where we work, organizations who have actually thrown up all the pieces and say, is this hybrid? Are we remote? Are we virtual? Are we in person? This is such a great opportunity for us, as we all know, to take a look at these systems and structures that for years just were really never thought about. It was just, that's just the way you hire. And so coming together around this work is really exciting. My colleague Lauren Ruffin, about a year ago, I was talking to her about the work that Katrina and I were doing, and she's like, yeah, hiring is pretty dusty. Like, executive search is really dusty. It's like most people do it exactly the same way that they did it in 1982. And so taking a moment to, as Katrina was saying, pull all these pieces apart and say, let's look at the offer stage. What are the power dynamics in an offer stage? What if you imagine the offer stage through a lens of anti-racism or through justice? How might those pieces come together differently? Because I think 99% of organizations probably all hire the same way, and probably all hire pretty much in the same way, except, as her colleague Jamie Gamble put out, the internet now exists, as they did 40 years ago. Probably using the same questions that they did 40 years ago. And so this is a really great opportunity to say, all right, here's how we did it, but does it really work for us? Does anyone like this process? It's comfortable, we know we can replicate it, but what if we paused, like we're doing this course, to really reimagine it? Because here on this next slide, here are sort of the traditional pieces of a hiring process. And sort of all know these, we have to make the position profile, and then we look for the candidates. We come up with a recruiting plan. We go out and post in various places and ask people for candidates. Then we sort of winnow it down to the handful of candidates that we're going to put through a screener process based off of resumes and cover letters. And then we go through 1 to 8 interview rounds, depending on your organization and maybe how many people are involved, and it goes into reference checks, and then those questions, and then offer and acknowledgement and rejection communication. So yeah, this is like the traditional hiring process. And then usually at the end of that job posting, it's that standard equal employment opportunity. So-and-so is an equal employment employer. Like, probably not. It's just the standard language that gets included there. But one of the fun things that so we'll be doing is, like, at each stage here, what if we pulled that apart and looked at it and said, how would we do this differently? So yeah, this is what the course is. Katrina.